All right, so welcome back. Finally comes the talk that Marcus has advertised so much. You're going to learn about unconventional policy with sticky prices in the new Keynesian framework. So the idea is basically to kind of pick up where Marcus has left off before the lunch, and to think how can we enrich the one-sector money model to include the elements that we need for studying optimal monetary policy, both conventional and unconventional. So the first thing we have to decide on is what are the things that we add? What are the new elements that we want to have? Some of these elements you had seen in Gautam's talk. Others are going to be new. And we're going to try to kind of add them step by step. So the first thing that you want to have if you're talking about monetary policy is probably sticky prices. Once you have sticky prices, you're going to have an output gap, and then your short-term interest rate is going to have an output gap management role. Talking about optimal monetary policy in the flex price model can be tricky, and I think when people at the central banks, when they think about optimal monetary policy, that's kind of what they have in mind, or at least that's the thing that comes to their mind first. The second element that we want to add is the one we're going to need for the unconventional part. The way we're going to be thinking about the unconventional policy is asset purchase programs when the central bank buys or sells, in our case, long-term government bonds in exchange for reserves. So if you want to have a meaningful policy along these dimensions, you need to have both reserves and the long-term bonds in the model explicitly introduced in order for the central bank to trade this asset. So that's the next element that we're going to need. You have seen that, again, partially. Marcus has briefly touched upon the long-term government bonds. Finally, we would like to have a financial intermediary sector for two reasons. One reason is that we want to have an agent that is going to be special in the sense that it's going to be the only agent holding central bank's reserves. So in real world, not everyone can hold central bank reserves. It's only the commercial banks, or more broadly, the financial sector that can hold them. Long-term bonds can be held by anyone in principle, but the reserves are special to these financial intermediaries. And whenever the central bank conducts balance sheet policies, for example, it buys long-term bonds and issues reserves, the long-term bonds, it's just buying it on the market. It could be buying it from anyone and potentially distorting the distribution of these long-term bonds across private agents, but the reserves will always go to the financial sector. And the second reason why we want to have it is because these feature the fact that you can be distorting the distribution of long-term bond holdings across agents is going to get an additional role for both the conventional interest rate policy and the balance sheet policies. It's going to be the distributional role, because once you hike the interest rates and you change the price of the long-term bonds, you're going to be affecting different types of agents potentially differently. And the same is going to be true for the balance sheet policies. So there's going to be another dimension, another target in some sense for the central banks, that they will not only be thinking about the aggregates like in standard models where you want to fix the output gap, you think about aggregate inflation, but you will also be thinking about how your policies affect the distribution of wealth and consumption in the economy. And of course, we want to have a sufficiently rich central bank policy toolkit. We're going to have short-term interest rate policy, and we will have the balance sheet management. Again, in our setting, is going to be just about the long-term government bonds. We won't have any MBS or corporate bonds, none of that. We're going to focus. That's what we're going to mean by balance sheet. And once you have all of these elements, you can start asking questions like, what is each of these instruments, which role does each of these instruments play? What is the role of the short-term rate? What is the role of balance sheet policies? How do they interact? Does the balance sheet policy affect the way the interest rates propagates in the economy? All of these kind of things. Or putting it differently, having gone through a big expansion of the central bank balance sheet, should the central banks rethink the way they set short-term interest rates, or can they kind of just keep going as if nothing has changed before? And once we understand all of this, we can start thinking about what would be the welfare optimizing mix of these two instruments. So how can we conduct the conventional and the unconventional policies jointly in order to maximize social welfare? And just to give you a heads up, we will try to stay as much as possible, and we will stay for a very, very long time, pretty much throughout the whole talk, analytical. So when we're going to build this model, we have to be very careful how exactly we add these elements. There are going to be some tricks that are not going to be important conceptually, but are going to be important for our analytic tractability. There are going to be some choices that we have to make, but the good outcome is that we will be able to talk about all of this, about optimal policy mix in a model with both idiosyncratic and aggregate risk, two sectors, sticky prices, and still keep things analytical. That was a question.
Do you have any difference between short-term bonds and reserves? And when you say interest rate policy, is it like interest on reserves or something else?
In the end, it's going to be the interest on reserves. That's going to be the short-term interest rate. And we will not have any short-term government bonds. They're going to be basically replaced by reserves. That's what Marcus was talking about, that in the one sector money model, they're the same. What is going to make them somewhat different is that reserves can only be held by the financial sector, but not by the households. That's going to be the only distinction between what you had seen as short-term bonds before and the reserves in this model. All right. So, and as I said, we will try to do it kind of step by step, and we will start from the one sector money model as introduced by Marcus, at least some of its versions. So that's where we're starting from. We have just the households for now. They maximize their log utility of consumption. They choose how much to consume, how much to invest in capital, and their portfolio weight on capital. That's the evolution of their net worth that you have seen already many times. There's a fraction that goes into, for now, short-term bonds. I keep the notation of P. We're going to substitute that later. And in capital. That's the return. What is going to be now different from what you had seen before is that we're going to have aggregate risks. So now we have these DZ terms without the tildes. So we keep the idiosyncratic risk. The return on capital is subject to these sigma tilde shocks, or DZ tilde shocks with volatility sigma tilde. But unlike before, this sigma tilde is moving around over time stochastically. And this is where the aggregate risk is coming from. So if you remember Marcus's picture where he had sigma tilde on the x-axis and various equilibrium variables on the y-axis, we're going to have something like that. The only thing is that sigma tilde is not going to be a parameter anymore, but it's going to be moving over time stochastically. This is going to be its slow of motion, so there's going to be some mean reverting component. Whenever you're above the steady state, you're drifting back, so this psi is positive, and there's going to be some volatility loading on this aggregate shock. So basically, the aggregate risk is going to be in the amount of idiosyncratic risk. The aggregate shocks make the idiosyncratic shocks larger or smaller. Yeah.
So that's I guess going forward to make the value of safe assets and like fluctuate with the state of the aggregate clock increasing.
That's going to be the case, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is that so the question is whether we want to have aggregate risk at all, or whether we want to have it in this particular way.
Sorry, isn't it the log motion for the variance on idiosyncratic risk?
Yes, so that's your idiosyncratic risk, and it's drifting back to the steady state, but sometimes it is hit by aggregate shocks.
I guess why that's sufficient for the variance of idiosyncratic risk.
Why? Oh, you mean why would you have this volatility?
Yes,
I see. Okay.
It's supposed to be like just constant.
Yeah, makes sense. So this volatility loading we can change. That's not going to affect almost all of our results as long as we have a stationary distribution of this sigma tilde and it doesn't go negative. So we want to have a proper distribution. For some analytical results, this specification turns out to be particularly nice, but I'm not even sure if I'm going to get to those. But for, you can, the standard way to model this would be the Cox-Ingersoll-Rolls process where you don't have the square. But we just put the square because in some cases it turns out to be particularly nice. But we don't need it for most of the things. OK. So now the first thing that we want to add are going to be sticky prices. And that is going to be relatively standard with a couple of differences from the sticky prices that you have probably surely seen in the textbook New Keynesian model. The one difference, this is going to be continuous time. Second difference, we're not going to have labor. because in textbook New Keynesian model, you have households that supply labor, and that's the margin of adjustment whenever you have monetary shocks and you have movements in demand. We're not going to have that, so we're going to have to do something with capital. But broadly speaking, these are the only two differences from what you already know. The setup is going to be as follows. We're going to have households that supply or produce a common input good, YT. So before, what we had is that these households, they were producing the consumption good directly. So they were holding capital. 1 unit of capital would give you A units of the consumption good. Now they're not going to be producing the consumption good directly. They will be producing what we call a common input good. And this common input good, they will be selling to the monopolistic producers, and each of these individual monopolistic producers is going to be adding a variety to that common good. So they, I'm not sure if apples is a good analogy for here, but they all make the same apples, and then the monopolistic producers make whatever. They bake them, they make juice, they cut them in slices. And then once they've done that, once they've added all these varieties, they sell it to the final good producer that bundles all of that apple stuff into one nice lunch, I don't know. And does it according to the CES aggregator as standard. You get the standard demand function, so how much you demand particular variety depends on its relative price of the variety relative to the aggregate price level. So let's go a little bit deeper into that. As I said before, we need an additional margin of adjustment on the supply side once we have sticky prices, because if you have flexible prices, something happens to demand, price can always adjust to clear the markets. Now prices will not be adjusting, or at least not adjusting in full. That means that something else needs to adjust to clear the markets, and that's going to be the supply. In the textbook model, you have labor. If there's a shock, households just work more or less. Since we don't have labor, and we don't want to have labor because that's going to ruin all of our nice analytical tractability, we're going to use capital utilization. So whenever there's a shock, you're going to kind of run your machines faster. If you need to produce more, you're going to run them slower if you want to produce less. The way it's going to work is that we need a new variable for capital utilization. It's going to be this upsilon t. And then as a household, you produce a upsilon t kt units of this common input good. So again, you have k units of capital. Each unit produces a units of the input good, but then you can produce more or less by changing your utilization. The way it's going to enter our setup is first through the return on capital, because remember, before you were just producing one consumption good. Now what you're doing is you're still using capital, but now you're producing a upsilon of the input goods per unit of capital, and then you're selling it to the monopolistic producers with sticky prices at an endogenous price PT. So that's going to be what a household gets out of their production. And then this utilization, of course, becomes another variable that enters, that determines the return on capital, so that households will have to make another choice of how much to utilize. And then they also get these kind of funny-looking DET part, which are going to be just the profits from these monopolistic producers, because they're going to be making some profits. Whenever they make a profit, they will be transferring it to the households. The other thing what is going to enter is that we want to have some reason for households not to utilize all the way. So again, in the textbook model, you have this utility of working, so that prevents you from working indefinitely. Here we're going to have this utility of utilization. They're going to be utility cost associated with capital utilization. So utility, the flow utility is going to be log consumption minus some convex function of utilization. All right. Now let's go to the monopolistic producers. They're going to be more standard. There's going to be a continuum of them. They will have linear technology, so that when they buy one input good, they make one variety, one unit of variety of that good. They can adjust prices only in a drift way, so their price level cannot respond to aggregate shocks. And they choose this drift pi t subject to a Rodenberg cost. They have flow profits, which are basically their nominal revenue divided by the aggregate price level. So that's real revenue minus their real cost, which is the number of input units that they buy times the price, and then we allow for the standard tax subsidy, same as in the textbook model, to correct for the monopoly power. Yes?
Why can't they, I guess, choose a strategy that loads on the aggregate shock?
It's an assumption of your price stickiness. So
Because they would still be sticky.
it could still be sticky, yeah.
Now,
You could,
because you still have the adjustment costs.
then you would have to specify what is your adjustment. So here I'm specifying the adjustment in terms of the drift. If I'm making it change, so the adjustment is in this pi jt, that's the adjustment cost, and that's the drift part. Then if I allow you to react to aggregate shocks, I would need to have another cost on that.
Because that would undo the stickiness.
That would not undo the stickiness because you would still not be responding kind of in full. You would be responding less than how much you would respond on the flexible prices. But that's just a simpler way of writing things. And that's the standard way. All right. Now, these firms are going to have an objective function, which is going to be basically their discounted stream of profits, where I just plugged in the demand. So if you go back here, that's the demand for their product, for their varieties, given their price. You plug it into their flow profits, and then you get this expression where you also subtract the flow costs of adjustment, and you also subtract some taxes that are raised to finance this subsidy. All right. So, and again, that bit is pretty standard. What you get out of it is, if you assume a symmetric equilibrium, you get the new Keynesian-Phillips curve, which is, again, written in continuous time. So if you had seen it in discrete time, this might look kind of strange, because, first of all, this is not written in differences, not in derivatives, but in integral form, but the interpretation is the same. So what I have here on the right-hand side are the differences between real marginal costs under sticky prices and the real marginal costs under flexible prices. And so whenever a firm expects that its real marginal costs in the future are going to be above the flex price marginal costs, it's going to be raising its prices, it's going to have some inflation pie. Yeah.
Why do we discount with the risk?
We don't discount with the risk-free rate. Sorry, that's not the risk-free rate. It's the proper rate that comes out of this problem. It's not going to be risk-free rate. It's going to be based on the households SDF, but it's going to have some parts that are going to be different. So the idea is that these firms are owned by the households, so they're going to take their SDF, but it's not the risk-free rate. All right. Yeah.
How you weight the SDF? Or there's a representative.
There's not going to be a representative household. I'm looking just at the aggregate consumption of the household sector.
Okay. So
I'm not going to have any idiosyncratic component to it.
Okay. So you compute aggregate consumption,
Yes.
and then you transform aggregate consumption into utility function.
Exactly. Yes?
Because we do price stickiness, will profits be countercyclical in this case?
Oh, probably.
Worry at all about that with regards to the financial sector?
No, because this does not enter the financial sector in any way, and these profits are not going to matter that much because this is owned by the households.
There's no...
The redistribution of that, yes, exactly.
I'll leave this to
Okay.
Is there a way to use Calvo, or you just can use Rottenberg?
You can use Calvo. We have not done it, but you can do it. It's just that you're going to get an additional PD that you need to solve. Rottenberg is the kind of typically the way to go in continuous time because it keeps things simpler. My conjecture is that with Calvo you're going to get very similar results because you're still going to have this feature that your price level only drifts, does not have any jumps. So I don't think there would be any major differences. All right. So now as we said before, the aggregate price level is also going to only drift with inflation rate pi t. Is not going to be loading on the aggregate shocks. Okay. So now let's go. Let me maybe just briefly conclude. We have added sticky prices. The only thing that has changed is that now we have a different return on capital and additional decision for the households. And we have this new Keynesian Phillips curve that we just add to the model. And the rest stays the same, so you can go through the same logic, deriving law of motion over theta and so on.
And finding D is per unit of capital.
Finding these per unit, yes, exactly. I redistribute profits to capital holders.
Because then, in this way, it doesn't create redistribution.
Exactly, yes. Okay, so now we have sticky prices. Now let's add intermediary sector, and this is going to be very similar to what you had seen in Gautam's presentation. So again, we're going to have households that are subject to this idiosyncratic risk that they dislike because they're risk averse. They would like to get rid of this idiosyncratic risk, well, aggregate risk too, and they can issue risky claims on their capital and the flow the fraction chi of that risk to intermediaries. Same as before. And also same as before, these intermediaries, they're going to hold these claims, and they will be able to diversify at least part of that idiosyncratic risk away, so they will not be subject to all the risk that is offloaded by the households, but only to a fraction of it. The difference is that we will not have any chi upper bar like there was in the Gautam's presentation. So in theory, households can offload 100%. But in equilibrium, they will not be doing that. All right, so this is the problem of intermediaries so far. They have log utility. They choose how much to consume, and they allocate their wealth across these three assets. Again, for now, short-term government bonds, deposits that they issue to the households, and the outside equity claims. So these risky claims on capital, again, same as what you had seen before. And then here we can see that when an intermediary holds this risky claim, they're subject to all of the aggregate risk that is sitting on that risky claim, but only subject to a fraction var phi of the idiosyncratic risk. So for comparison, households, the return that they are paying on these claims does not have any var phi. So when they offload 1 unit of risk, of idiosyncratic risk, intermediaries only take on fraction var phi of that unit onto their balance sheet. All right. The last thing you have to do is we want the reserves and the long-term bonds. As I said, reserves are going to be pretty straightforward. They're going to be the same as short-term bonds. They pay some interest IT. Now it's going to be interest on reserves, subject to inflation. That's the real return. And all the intermediaries can hold them. So households will not have these assets in their portfolios. Yes? Yep.
The return RX for household.
Yep.
Is the return on capital?
No. So the risk that is offloaded is going to be the same as the one on capital, but the expected return is going to be endogenously determined, which I guess here will not necessarily be the one that is on capital.
So it's like the insider.
Exactly. You can think of inside and outside. Exactly. Yes.
And then the households can issue outside equity.
That's the outside equity.
Yeah, but they cannot buy the outside equity of other households.
No, they cannot do that. So all the diversification needs to happen through intermediaries.
And are you going to have the S&P 500 or not?
No, there's not going to be. So again, all diversification needs to go through intermediaries. They are the only ones that have the technology to do that.
So profits just go to households.
Of the monopolistic firms. Yes. Yes.
Why isn't the deposit rate and
Because I hadn't. I showed you. Sorry. I showed you this before I introduced the intermediaries. So in the end, it will be there. Okay, I'm going to be back to balance sheets, so then I think we can see, once we put everything in, we can have a picture on everything, a view on everything. Okay, so reserves, we've done now the long-term bonds. They're going to be perpetual, so they have infinite maturity. They'll be paying a fixed nominal interest IL. That's going to be fixed, it's not going to be time varying. And they will have nominal price PTL, and everybody can hold them, households and intermediaries. And the return, the real return, is going to be the yield, which is the interest rate divided by the nominal price of a long-term bond, plus the gain term, which is sort of intuitive, that the change in the price and the change in the price level to make it real. So we were going to have some drift of the long-term bond price here, and we will have a volatility loading because the price of long-term bonds can potentially react to aggregate shocks. It's an endogenous price. This one is not going to be sticky. Yes.
Is this IL exogenous specified?
Yes, and it's not going to matter pretty much at all.
So for Citibank, do not control.
So this is going to be picked by the fiscal authority, but the value of it is not. The value of this is going to affect the kind of say steady state value of this, but that's not going to matter otherwise. Yeah.
Your interest on reserves will have effect on price levels, so that will affect the real return on long term.
Exactly.
That's
That's going to come later. Yes. Yes.
And the bond is really a perpetuity. It's not decaying perpetuity. It's really
No.
bond forever.
It's exactly perpetual. We could make it decaying. The expressions are going to be slightly less simple, but I don't think that is important. You just need two different assets of different maturity, and you want to have, as was said, that the short-term rate affects the price of a longer-term asset.
So you have this assumption that only intermediaries hold reserves to create a segmentation, or like?
I think it's just institutional details that we want to include. I don't think that. I think we could have CDBC.
Segmentation kind of, right?
So we're not. Yes, but that's so they can issue deposits. There's going to be sort of a tiny degree of market segmentation that I'm going to talk about on the next slide, but I think we can let them issue CDBC, and I don't think that's going to affect our results. I think, as long as we have the assumption that it's going to come on the next slide. Yes?
In the paper about the I theory of money, when they do the opportunity, they find the nominal price in terms of unit of coupon payment. Is there a reason why you don't do that? Or it's just a notational detail that doesn't matter?
I don't think that it matters how you define it. I don't think so. It's just the price. You choose your numeraire. You have to choose a numeraire. And then
I think that IL is not an interest rate, it's a coupon.
yeah, that's a better way to put it. Yes. Yes, it's in dollars. Yes, I think I should. Yes, you're right. Okay, so now what is new is that we don't have just short-term assets as part of our nominal wealth, but we also have these long-term assets. And so our total nominal wealth, which I will keep calling B, is going to consist of reserves plus long-term bonds. So the B is going to be now everything put together. Our reserves, PL times L, is going to be the value of long-term bonds. So now comes the assumption that we need to, let's say, to keep the model non-trivial. What we need is we want to drive kind of a wedge between deposits and long-term bonds. If we don't have that feature, then the agents, the households and the intermediaries, they can trade long-term bonds and deposits and basically perfectly share aggregate risk. And that's not going to be neither optimal from the point of view of the planner, nor something that we want to have as part of the model. So, and in that sense, I think we could include something like CDBC, but as long as you still have a wedge between CBDC and long-term bonds, I think that should still work. How are we going to do it? Marcus already talked about it. We can add a transaction cost. So conceptually, the way you do it does not really matter. It could be money in utility. It could be cash in advance constraint. Again, what turns out to be analytically convenient is a transaction cost on velocity. So what we're assuming is that you need deposits as a household. You need deposits for transactions related to your capital. And you're going to use these deposits with some velocity nu. So if you have this much capital and this much deposits, then your velocity is just going to be the ratio between the two. So if you have very few deposits, then you need to use them with very high velocity. And that's going to come at a higher transaction cost t that is going to enter your return on capital. So you're going to have to pay a higher transaction cost if you're holding too few deposits relative to capital. And then that just means that our return on the capital gets yet another decision variable, this velocity that enters through the transaction cost. And then we basically get an additional constraint for the households. But it's kind of a soft constraint in the sense that nu t is a choice variable. So it just comes at a cost. All right. And as I said, this prevents agents from perfectly hedging each other against aggregate risk. And that is going to be our sort of soft market segmentation, if you want to think about it. So we don't have a strict market segmentation in the sense that everybody can hold long-term bonds, but some agents are going to have sort of a convenience yield on deposits purely to prevent them from sharing aggregate risk perfectly. That's the only reason why we put it in. Yes?
Rottenberg, that price dispersion term doesn't come at all.
There's not going to be any price dispersion because that's Rottenberg, and we look at a symmetric equilibrium. OK. So I think that we have everything. Now let's have a quick look at what we have arrived at. So we have households that hold deposits that are issued by intermediaries. They hold long-term bonds that are issued by the fiscal authority. They hold their capital. And then they can issue these risky claims or outside equity. So that's what they're offloading risk. And if you want to think about chi, so the fraction that they're offloading, it's going to be kind of the ratio between this rectangle and that one. So what is the proportion of this blue thing in this gray thing? That's going to be chi, how much risk they offload. And then intermediaries, they hold, again, long-term bonds. They also hold reserves. They are the only ones holding reserves. They hold these risky claims. They issue deposits. And then we have a central bank that I have slightly simplified by only giving it the long-term bonds and reserves. So the unconventional policy would be then central bank, let's say we're thinking about long-term bond purchases. It's going to be expanding its balance sheet. It's going to be issuing reserves and buying long-term bonds. But again, as I said before, who is going to sell these long-term bonds is going to be determined in equilibrium. So it could be that you're buying long-term bonds from the households. In that sense, the households now hold less of these long-term bonds. But you cannot, as a central bank, you cannot pay households directly. So you issue these reserves that go to the intermediaries. And then intermediaries issue deposits that are then used to pay to the household. So the central bank pays the household for long-term bond purchases through intermediaries. But it could also be that as you buy long-term bonds, you buy them directly from the intermediaries, and then you just swap one for the other. You swap reserves for long-term bonds. That does not in any way affect the household's balance sheet. Yeah, I think that's it. But one thing that to see is that by doing any of these operations, you are distorting the distribution of long-term bonds across the two agent types. And that's all going to be endogenous, and that's going to be very important in terms of implementation of optimal policy. All right. So now let's move on. Unless there are any questions on the, yes?
Just trying to understand if I'm following. Like in Keynesian, the welfare losses come from price dispersion across industries, right? And then here, all the welfare losses come from bearing, like an efficient bearing of aggregate risk.
And other things too, yes. So we're still going to have an output gap, which could be so they're not going to be price dispersion, but you can have an output gap. They're going to be inefficient distribution of risk, but also inefficient distribution of consumption, and inefficient accumulation of capital. They're going to be all of the things. I'm going to set up what is the efficient thing, and then maybe it's going to be cleaner. But no price dispersion. That's not something that concerns us. All right. So now, as I said, we want to do optimal policy. For that, we have to define what is optimal. And the way we proceed is follows. We're not going to try to take this model that I have just presented and do a Ramsey problem directly on it. So specify some set of policy tools and then try to solve that. I'm not sure if that's feasible, but for sure it's way more complicated than what we're going to do. So we're going to take a different approach in which we're going to think of a unrealistically powerful government. So fiscal authority plus the central bank together. We're going to make them unrealistically powerful to the extent that it's going to be relatively easy to solve for the optimal. We're going to make our optimal problem much simpler. And then we're going to, once we figure out what is the optimal allocation and understand how things work, we can go back and specify a realistic government. So the one that we could, in theory, provide our policy recommendations to, and then see whether that realistic government can implement the sort of the constraint efficient allocation and under which conditions and how. So that's going to be the plan. So the first step is we want to define something that we can deal with analytically and really understand how things work. So what is going to be this unrealistic government? It's going to be the government that can raise taxes over time, so in kind of the flow DT way. So think about the capital tax that we've had in the one sector money model. But not only that, but also in response to aggregate shocks. So loading directly on the DZT term. And that's going to be the unrealistic bit, because that means that this government would be able to come to the households following this aggregate shock and in an instant, for example, take a chunk of their wealth and give it to the intermediaries or spend it on something else. So this government would be able to do redistribution in an instant without having to collect these taxes kind of slowly over time. That's what is going to make it unrealistic. However, we would not allow this government to do the same with respect to idiosyncratic shocks. So the government can take a chunk of the household wealth of everyone, give it to intermediaries, and kind of distribute it proportionately, but it cannot come to two households and redistribute, for example, wealth between those two households. So that government is still going to be subject to idiosyncratic risk, but it's effectively not to the aggregate one. That means that this government behaves essentially as a planner that can freely pick all the aggregate variables in this economy, all the aggregate distributions, but not the within sector distributions. So what this planner is going to be doing is going to be choosing the capital utilization rate upsilon, the capital investment rate iota. That's going to determine the path of capital and the path of output, but also the distribution of wealth or consumption, which is the same in this model, across the two sectors, so across intermediaries and households. And eta, as before, is going to be the wealth share of intermediaries. So through this instant immediate redistribution, you can just pick any path of eta as you like. The same you can do with the distribution of wealth across assets. So again, var theta that you have seen before is going to be the wealth share that goes into nominal assets. Now remember, nominal assets consist of reserves and long-term bonds. You can pick any path of that. And you can also choose the distribution of idiosyncratic risk exposure chi. So remember how much households offload is this chi. As this kind of government, you can dictate that. But still, you will not be the agents in this economy will still be subject to idiosyncratic risk, but at least you can choose to how much of that idiosyncratic risk and how it is distributed between the two sectors. So this is going to be the objective of this planner. And what the planner is trying to do is to maximize welfare, which is the discounted stream of consumption of intermediaries and households weighted with some Pareto weights, lambda 1 minus lambda. Yeah.
Whenever we've seen kind of this optimization problem, it seems weird to me that for all intents and purposes, the intermediaries are probably like tiny, right, compared to the households,
yeah.
Right? So do we even care?
Well, just put a tiny lambda. So let me put it differently. We'll give you a different answer, a more interesting one. So here I treat these lambdas as just exogenous, so you just attach them. What we do in the paper is actually we have kind of an OLG setup where there's random switching. So sometimes you're a household, randomly you become an intermediary, and then you go back. And then these lambdas are going to come from sort of endogenously from the population, stationary population masses of the two types. So you can endogenize this lambda, and then you're basically going to, in a sense, you want to calibrate it. You can do that, yeah.
And how big is the stationary distribution usually? Because you have to calibrate, right?
Yes, that I don't know.
Yeah, I see. Because it seemed to me, at least in the other paper, right, that the results are strongly driven or influenced by the expert sector as well, right? Because they had pretty different shapes from the households, right? At least from the paper we've seen before. But yeah.
Yes. So you can calibrate. So what I'm going to tell you is going to go through for all lambdas that are, let's say, not too small. Not too small. There is a certain range in which things work. If you get lambdas that are too small, then things will not necessarily work. But it doesn't have to be big. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably just me. I'm not sure, this bugs me that this is a social planner problem, right? And social planner problem, right? And this has prices. So
you can get rid of this price by plugging this in there. Just a bit forget because this is Tobin skew, so we don't let the planner is still subject to Tobin skew. If you don't subject to that, then
only being subject to resource constraint, right?
Yes, but okay, think about this, as I said before, as a government with just a lot of instruments. And you do a Ramsey problem on that, that's what you're going to get. There are still some constraints that you cannot overcome. So this is one of the equilibrium constraints that we keep, as long as these ones that I'm going to talk about in a second. So it's a constraint-efficient allocation. It's not fully unconstrained. Okay, so let me quickly talk through that. So what is this? This is the consumption of an individual intermediary. How does it work? This is aggregate capital. The little c is the per capital consumption in the economy. And this is the total consumption. So then eta times that is the total consumption of the intermediary sector. And then eta tilde I is the fraction, the wealth share of an individual intermediary within the intermediary sector. So the product of these four is the consumption of an individual intermediary. You had a question?
How is this siting different from the siting okay, everyone is from household?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
How is this setting different from the setting okay, everyone is from a household? Some household becomes a banker, and there are some exogenous probability that if they die, would they switch back, and we have the same amount of bankers jumping in the economy?
Yes, it's the.
I think it's kind of the same.
Yeah, I think that's what I was saying. That you can, if you do that, then you're going to get exactly the same. It's just that lambda is not going to be exogenous, but depend on this. Yes, and also, I mean, you're going to get a different term in here that I don't want to talk about now. But that's exactly what we do in the paper. It's just for exposition, it's easier to present it this way. Yeah.
Can you maybe repeat why you have to tilde eta? What rules, please?
Yeah, I was trying to get there. No. So this thing is the consumption of an individual intermediary. And the same applies here, which is the consumption of individual household. The only difference is that households as a sector has a wealth share 1 minus eta. And the planner can pick these etas freely, but it cannot pick these eta tildes freely, because these eta tildes still evolve according to the law of motion that is there in the competitive equilibrium, where they're subject to this idiosyncratic risk. So how much they vary, for example, for intermediaries, depends on the distribution of risk, of idiosyncratic risk chi 1 minus chi. What is the wealth share of capital, so how much risk is there in terms of portfolio size. And then they also have this var phi kind of diversification technology that households don't have. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Could you give us a feeling at what we're missing compared to the real Ramsey pineapple problem with this
Nothing.
Or nothing?
So with respect to the extremely powerful, that's identical.
Okay.
Then there's going to come a more realistic one, and then well, you will see what we're going to miss. Okay. So now this still does not look too good because this is still kind of a dynamic problem where you have to optimize over this infinite. This is a sequence problem. Luckily, this all boils down to a static one. So because of log utility, you can do some transformations, and you're going to arrive to the result that this this welfare, total welfare that you maximize over indefinite future is just a sequence of period welfares. So everything you have to do as the planner, or this unrealistic government that can pick things period by period, is you just have to look at what is the sigma tilde, what is the idiosyncratic risk today, and then you choose your variables, the utilization, investment, the distribution of wealth and risk for just that sigma tilde. Tomorrow there's going to be another sigma tilde, or next instant there's going to be another sigma tilde. You're going to adjust. But there's no, in the end, you don't have to think about laws of motion of these things. They're not going to affect you. And this period welfare has kind of two components. So the first one we call the aggregate efficiency at period t. So what it depends on is utilization and investment. And the kind of trade-offs are pretty simple. If you utilize more, you're going to have more output, more consumption. But then the households will have to pay the utility cost because they're the ones that need to do the utilization. Investment, if you invest more, you're going to have more capital going forward. But then today, you're going to have to cut down on consumption. So that's pretty, I guess, obvious standard. And then there's the second term, the second line, which we call distributional efficiency. And that is a bit tricky, a bit more tricky, let's say, or more interesting, because first you have these two terms, the lambda log eta plus 1 minus lambda log 1 minus eta. That is basically just a distribution of consumption across the two sectors. And this thing is maximized if you essentially sort of smooth consumption across the two sectors, but taking the lambda Pareto weights into account. So that's going to be maximized if eta is lambda and 1 minus eta is 1 minus lambda. So you want a smooth consumption, but you keep in mind that you have different Pareto weights. The second term is related to idiosyncratic risk. So there's the idiosyncratic risk entering kind of in an obvious way, and then it also depends on, again, the capital share, so how much risk there is in total net worth terms. And it also depends on how this risk is split between intermediaries and households, because you split it in proportions chi 1 minus chi, so they both are subject to some part of the risk, but then intermediaries have this varphi ability to diversify that risk away. So if you were to minimize the total amount of idiosyncratic risk, what you would do, you would push everything to intermediaries. You would give them all the idiosyncratic risk because they are the ones that can diversify it away, but then they might not like it because they would be holding too much of that risk relative to their net worth share. So what you do optimally as this planner, you don't give the experts all of the risk. You still give them a lot, but less than 1. The share is less than 1. And you give them more risk relative to their consumption share. So in relative terms, they are kind of levered, or they're exposed to more risk than their consumption share is. And because of that, you actually compensate them by giving them the consumption share that is above their Pareto weight. So again, for consumption smoothing motives, you would want to give them eta equals lambda. For risk minimization, amount of risk minimization purposes, you want to give chi equal to 1, but you do something in the middle with taking these kind of trade-offs into account. Yes?
Are there non-trivial implications of using capital utilization inside the utility function? Because this is sort of, to me, in some way it looks like one of those capital and utility function setup, because my incentive to invest or not invest is going to be also influenced by my how much capital I'm utilizing today.
No. So that's the next slide. So what turns out here, let me maybe tell you now, it's going to be the case that your utilization under the planner at least is going to be flat. It's not going to depend on sigma tilde at all.
I was thinking in the general case.
Oh, I see. In the competitive equilibrium.
Yeah, like in general, will have created a different incentive to accumulate?
So I think it's hard to say if it's going to be affected, if your decision to invest is going to be affected by your utilization choice directly. Of course, kind of in the general equilibrium sense, yes, because the fact that you can utilize more or less is going to affect everything, and everything is going to affect your investment rate. But I don't know how much it distorts kind of at the individual level. To put it differently, we need something to prevent you from utilizing all the way. Conceptually, it can be anything. For analytic tractability, this turns out to be nice. That's the only reason why we do it exactly this way.
The reason I ask this is normally the cost is on a choice variable like labor supply that's presumably like this period.
Yeah.
But right now we're sort of impacting like the capital we're accumulating indirectly.
But how much you utilize your capital today does not affect how much it's going to grow over time. In that sense, there's no interaction. I have very little capital. I can utilize it a lot, but I can still choose a very low. So my capital accumulation equation is still the same. It's still phi of iota minus delta.
It's static. It's a static for every condition.
Exactly. That's like a static decision, and the other one is dynamic. And in that sense, they don't interact. I can utilize a lot, invest less. I can do the opposite. I know nothing about how much my capital grows just by looking at this utilization. What you could do, I don't know if I should spend time on it, you could put this utilization in the delta, in the depreciation. And then it's going to matter, because then if you utilize more, it's going to depreciate faster, but that's not what we're doing. So in that sense, it probably solves the problem that you had in mind. Yes?
It's very hard to I find it difficult to understand why capital utilization and decline is affecting, but I guess is that because you want to make the model simpler so you can focus on
Yes, so I have to ensure that you don't, so you have to decide how much to utilize your capital. And the more you utilize it, the more is going to be the output that you're going to get from it. So there must be something that hurts you in some way if you utilize it more. And that's our way of modeling that kind of, the negative part of higher utilization.
What was the marginal cost of
Marginal cost of?
You had a slide with marginal cost.
The little
real marginal cost was PT times.
It was MC. Oh, there was PT1 minus tau.
Does it have utilization?
No. So that thing does not enter. No. Utilization.
Because you have, in the traditional model, you have the marginal cost is the real wage, right? And that enters the static decision of the slide. And here, how is that?
Oh, that's what you mean. It does. It's so that's like your wage. That's going to be your wage, and that's going to be your labor supply. Yes. So in that sense,
I see.
And the wage is also sorry, since we're talking about it, and that's the wage that the firms. That's the same thing. The wage that the firms pay, and that's your labor supply again. So in that sense, it's almost the same. All right. So that's the planner, but again, so far we just talked about kind of static things. What is interesting is what happens if the idiosyncratic risk goes up or down. So what happens in the dynamic sense? As we just said, the planner just picks everything period by period, but sigma tilde is still moving around in a stochastic way. So, and that's going to be important to understanding how should policy react to this kind of shocks. And I'm going to explain it giving you a picture, but there's a proposition behind that picture. So not to write it in words, I'm just going to go through this in graphs because I think it's easier to understand. So suppose sigma tilde, the idiosyncratic risk goes up. What would the planner do? Will not do anything with respect to utilization because sigma tilde does not enter your utilization trade-off. But because capital is now more risky, you want to have less of it going forward. So you're going to disinvest. So investment rate is going to go down. Now, yeah.
Why are we going to disinvest? Because the risk is high using that, right?
Yes.
So like I'm only increasing the idiosyncratic risk. So is there some complexity thing from productivity being exponential, or what's the reason?
Because the agents are still holding this capital that is subject to idiosyncratic risk.
Okay, and I'm not allowed to redistribute across agents.
No. They're still subject to idiosyncratic risk.
Okay, so it's I see. Completely constrained efficient.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, my bad.
All right. Now, because this risk went up, you also want to do something to kind of counteract the rise in the idiosyncratic risk. There's two things you can do. One, you can raise var theta. So that's going to be flight to safety. You redistribute wealth away from the risky capital towards nominal assets that do not carry any idiosyncratic risk. That's one thing that you do as a planner. The second thing that you do, you increase chi. So you move risk away from the households towards intermediaries because they are the ones that have the better diversification ability. However, if that's the only thing that you do, so you just move more risk towards intermediaries, you make them really miserable because not only the idiosyncratic risk, the exogenous idiosyncratic risk went up, but also now they're holding a larger share of it. So they're getting hit way more. So you want to compensate them for it, a little bit at least, by giving them slightly more consumption. So the kind of bottom line of this, what the planner does following a idiosyncratic risk increase is it utilizes capital as much, it disinvests, and then it reallocates wealth in two dimensions. One dimension away from risky capital towards nominal assets. So that's flight to safety. And the second dimension along which the planner reallocates wealth is away from households towards intermediaries. So there's this wealth relocation across assets and across agents. All right. So now let's go back to our competitive equilibrium, and let's see what happens in kind of a laissez-faire economy. So suppose there are these shocks to idiosyncratic risk, but there is no policy response. So we kind of shut down that. And we see what happens, and we see whether things go kind of in the same way as under the optimal allocation. And, well, obviously they will not go, but then we'll have an idea of what exactly we need to fix and also a suggestion or a hint how we can fix it. So recall the aggregate efficiency requires, efficiency of the aggregates of the path of total capital and total output. That requires if you have a shock to sigma tilde goes up, you should disinvest, but don't touch utilization. Just produce as much given your current stock of capital. Let's see what happens in competitive equilibrium. Let's go to our goods market clearing condition. So this is your output minus investment is consumption, is rho times your net worth. And net worth has QK and QB being now the real value of nominal wealth scaled by capital, but nominal wealth consists of reserves and long-term bonds. So that's just the goods market clearing condition. Now we can use the Tobin's Q. So remember, there's a relationship between QK and investment. So we can substitute for it, and then we arrive here, which says that on the left-hand side we have output A times utilization. On the right-hand side we have investment and rho times QB. And what the planner says is that the left-hand side should not move following a shock to idiosyncratic risk, but investment needs to go down. The only way both of these things can be satisfied is if the value of the real value of your nominal assets increases in value. So you need this ratio to go up. Now, the price level is sticky, so P is not going to move. K is a predetermined variable. It's not going to move either. The only thing that can move is the sum of reserves, so is a total nominal wealth in nominal terms. That's the only thing that can move. Obviously, if you're not responding in any way with policy, that doesn't move either. So it's impossible for you to move investment down, keeping utilization constant, because under sticky prices and without policy response, this last term is not moving either. If you want to put it in terms of output gaps, we have kind of two output gaps because we have capital accumulation. So we have our output consisting of A times upsilon times total capital. That's total output. And then if you divide by the optimal one, the path of output under the planner that we have just discussed, then there's going to be two gaps. There's going to be the instantaneous gap, and that is like the labor gap in the standard models. So given your stock of capital, whether you utilize it to the right extent or not. And the second gap is going to be with respect to the stock of capital. So does your capital evolve over time in an efficient way or not? And this is dependent on your investment, because that's what determines the evolution of the total capital stock. So what it means that if you don't have any policy response in these variables, so not just, you can move things, you can do some, policy responses, as long as this sum stays constant, you're going to either have an instantaneous output gap or you're going to have a dynamic output gap. You will not be able to close the output gap going forward entirely. And that's basically the same thing that I said in words or written out on the slide. And then basically what the policy needs to do, so kind of the hint that we get from here is that if we want to replicate, to achieve the efficient allocation, our policy needs to move this nominal wealth in response to a shock. It needs to move it up. Now let's go to the distributional efficiency. Remember that if idiosyncratic risk goes up, the planner says we want to redistribute wealth towards nominal assets where theta goes up and eta goes up, and towards intermediaries. Now in sigma, eta, sigma over theta terms, so the loadings on the Brownian, that just means that they both need to be positive. So when there's a shock arrives, they both go up. It's the same. If we look at the balance sheet of intermediaries, again, assuming that nominal wealth is not moving, so shutting down that kind of policy response, what we'll see is that in competitive equilibrium, when the risk goes up, there is going to be a flight to safety. So the agents will see that capital is now risky. The value of nominal assets, including deposits, is going to go up. The value of capital is going to go down. So var theta is going to go up. So the wealth share is going to move towards nominal assets. So sigma var theta is going to be positive. And that's great, because that's what the planner says should happen. The planner likes the flight to safety. However, the problem comes with the fact that intermediaries in competitive equilibrium and under the planner, under the efficient allocation too, are levered. So that means that they have more nominal assets. They're more exposed to nominal assets on the liability side. They're short in nominal assets, and they're long in this risky real assets, in these risky claims. So whenever there's flight to safety and nominal assets appreciate in value because intermediaries are levered, they're going to take a hit. So what happens is that the liability side of intermediaries expands, the asset side shrinks, and their net worth goes down. So essentially, we do have flight to safety, which is great, but it causes the redistribution to go in the opposite direction compared to what the planner says is going to be optimal. So in this competitive equilibrium, we have a tension between the flight to safety and the redistribution. Under the planner, both var theta and eta go up. They move in the same direction. In competitive equilibrium, again, absent policy, they will be moving in opposite directions. You could engineer kind of a reverse flight to safety, so flight to risk, and you could push the eta up, but that would come at the cost of making var theta go down, which again would not be optimal. And the job of the policy is essentially to break this tight link between the distribution of wealth across assets and across agents, and to redistribute wealth towards intermediaries, preserving the flight to safety happening as well. So I think that was the first one.
It sounds like you want to capitalize banks and crises. And I wonder if this enters the model or not, but doesn't this lead to, or would this lead to like moral hazard in practice? The banks know when the risk actually materializes, because they also want the risk of the volatility increase, right? They can compensate for that, for the aggregate risk default. Which one would it?
So in this model, there are no moral hazard considerations. So that's just what comes out optimal. With moral hazard considerations, I guess that could be an issue. Then you maybe want to go towards Gautam's paper and introduce some leverage constraints to prevent them from accumulating too much risk so that they are not hit too much. But that's not something that we have in here. But that's a valid point. Yes?
It's like where there's 14 intermediaries, the L bonds are a hedge or a
Very good. They're going to be an anti-hedge.
So a source of risk.
A source of risk. But we're going to come to that. No. Okay. All right. So now, finally, let's say what this. Now that we understand what kind of goes wrong in the competitive equilibrium and what needs to be fixed, let's introduce a realistic government. So something that we could at least think of implementing in reality. So let's have a central bank that has two interest rates, one on required reserves, one on excess reserves, and also potentially reserve requirements, and can issue central bank reserves with a drift and with a volatility loading. And in the same fashion, it can purchase or sell long-term bonds, again with a drift and with a volatility loading. So the central bank is going to be, in some sense, fast in this setup. The central bank would be able to load its long-term bond purchases and reserves issuance directly on this aggregate risk. The fiscal authority, in contrast, is going to be slower in the sense that it can issue long-term bonds, but only with the drift component. So the long-term bond issuance cannot respond immediately, instantaneously to these ad shocks. What it captures is, well, as I said, the fact that we typically think of central banks as being more flexible, being able to respond to changing economic conditions faster. If you think about issuing bonds, that happens at auctions that need to be set ahead of time. You have to announce the amount that you're issuing, the type of bonds that you're doing. You're way less flexible than the central bank that can just go do some open market operations and buy or sell long-term bonds. And this is captured by allowing this loading on the volatility loading for the central bank, but by not allowing the same for the fiscal authority. That's basically one of the key assumptions of this setup. And sort of speaking more generally, I guess it's fair to say that if you want to have any role for the central bank, you have to somehow constrain the fiscal authority, because otherwise you can do anything with taxes if you don't constrain them. So the long-term bond holdings of private agents, this L is going to be whatever the intermediaries hold plus whatever the households hold, and that's going to be whatever is issued by the fiscal authority minus whatever is held by the central bank. And then we're going to have a new variable alpha that is going to be the share of long-term bond holdings of intermediaries among all the long-term bonds that are held by private agents. So alpha is Li divided by Li plus LH. That's the distribution of long-term bonds across private agents. And sorry, I should have said, what we do also allow for the fiscal authority to do is to raise flow taxes. And I'm not going to, so again, you can do it in the drift way. You cannot tax instantly. That assumption is still there. And I'm not going to go into what these taxes are and how they work, but I'm going to focus on the interest rate and balance sheet policies. But we will always have some fiscal authority working in the background. I'm just not going to be talking about it. Yes?
Are you saying the fiscal authority will adjust the taxes to kind of clear?
They're going to work, again, what Marcus was saying, it's a consolidated government. I don't have any tensions between the two. All right, so let's first understand what is balance sheet policy and how it's going to enter the model. Balance sheet policy is going to act on this variable var theta L. So var theta was the share of nominal assets within total wealth. Var theta L is the share of long-term bonds within all nominal assets. If you conduct balance sheet policies, you swap, for example, long-term bonds for reserves, and that drives var theta L down. So you just act on the quantities and you change this proportion. The interest rate, as someone mentioned before, is going to control the sensitivity of the bond price with respect to aggregate shocks. So it's going to act on this sigma TPL. I'm not sure if we should talk about this, but the idea is that if you cut the short-term interest rate, your nominal price of a long-term bond is going to appreciate, and that's going to determine this volatility of this long-term bond price, and that's going to be determined by how your interest rate, short-term interest rate, reacts to shocks. So going forward, what we're going to be thinking about is you do interest rate policy to control sigma PL, you do balance sheet policy to control var theta L, to control the shares. Now, the first kind of benchmark that we're going to look at is suppose that you don't do any balance sheet policy over the cycle, but you do something that we call passive balance sheet management. You kind of commit to a fixed VRT-TL. You commit to a fixed proportion of long-term bonds and reserves in the economy, and you keep it constant forever. How much can you do? How much close can it take you to the efficient allocation? And the first proposition is that with this passive balance sheet management, if you conduct fiscal policy in the realistic government sense, plus the interest rate policy, you can implement aggregate efficiency. So you can achieve the efficient path of aggregate output. You're going to have efficient utilization and investment. How are you going to do that? Remember, this was our equation that we looked at. We want utilization not to move. We want investment to go down. We want this B, the total nominal wealth, to go up. So this consists of reserves and long-term bonds. So suppose you try to do QE or QT, whatever. You buy long-term bonds and you drive long-term bonds down because you're buying them. You increase reserves. If you do balance sheet policy in response to the shock, you're not doing anything to the sum. You're only changing the composition. So when the shock has arrived, it's too late for you to start swapping long-term bonds for reserves because that's going to change the composition. It's going to matter going forward. But for that particular shock, you're not going to move the total nominal wealth because you're doing that at market prices. So that's too late. What you should do instead, you should act not on the quantities, but you should act on the price. Because with your short-term interest rate policy, you can affect the price of the long-term bond. And in fact, how much the total nominal wealth responds to a shock, so this sigma B, is just a product of your fixed VRT-TL, your passive balance sheet management policy, and the responsiveness of the bond price to these shocks. And the first one you control with balance sheet management. The second one you control with your interest rate policy. Which basically means that even though doing balance sheet management following the shock is not going to help you, it's still going to matter how much you need to cut your interest rate when the idiosyncratic risk goes up. So essentially, your interest rate policy depends on all the previous balance sheet policies that you have conducted. It depends on the decomposition between reserves and the long-term bonds that is there in the economy that when the shock hits. So in that sense, if you had done a lot of balance sheet expansions in the past, and you have a large central bank balance sheet, which means that you have a smaller VRT-TL because you've taken a lot of long-term bonds out of the economy, you need a more aggressive interest rate policy. Because if VRT-TL is smaller, then the long-term bond price needs to adjust by more. And for that, you need a stronger interest rate cut. And this also highlights this kind of preparatory role of balance sheet management in the sense that you don't do any balance sheet management when the shock arrived, but you have to do it, you have to think about it, how to place it, how to place your economy in the good position such that your interest rate cut following the arrival of the shock is going to deliver the right response. That's the first result. Second result, can we actually think about distributional efficiency at the same time? So just a second. Can I go? I have 10 minutes. Or no, you just you just gave it. Yes. Okay, I'll try not to go over too much. Yes.
Yeah, like generally this balance sheet policies, they are generally done when there is like no private demand, right? Like kind of like I'm thinking about GFC. So you are trying to fill up that gap of private demand through this kind of policies, and injecting liquidity. But here it doesn't seem like you do that for that purposes.
Exactly. So here we are not thinking. So you can do balance sheet. Let me put it differently. You can do balance sheet policies whenever there is some kind of friction on the market, such that you're going to have a price effect, and that's what is kind of in theory why you do that. However, you can do that also when there is no friction on the market, without the intention of affecting the price, but exactly with the intention of preparing for the next shock that is going to arrive. That's a different way of thinking, that you're not doing it when there's something wrong with the bond market, with the long-term bond market, but you're doing it, as part of your regular toolkit. Or at least you think about, what is the good passive balance sheet management target, or at least you change your interest rate policy depending on where you are.
Another rationale that people give sometimes is like, because you have that zero lower bound problem, so probably you can't move your interest
Yes,
rate
we don't have that either.
Yeah, so
Yeah, we don't have that either. No, fair, yes. We're thinking of different ways how these things matter, away from the zero lower bound, and at times when there's not any problem with the bond market per se.
The last slide was aggregate efficiency, right?
Sorry?
The last slide was aggregate efficiency.
This was aggregate efficiency, yes. Yes. So now let's see if passive balance sheet management can give us distributional efficiency. So again, the intermediary's balance sheet, now we have all the policy in there. The first two terms we have seen and discussed already. Now we have this long-term bond price changing, and we have the Varthita in there, and we also have the alpha, that is the share of long-term bonds that is held by intermediaries. So if I cut down my interest rate and my long-term bond price goes up, it's going to redistribute wealth to intermediaries in two ways, or away from intermediaries in two ways. One is going to be the direct bond revaluation effect. That's going to depend on this alpha. So that's pretty straightforward. If the intermediaries are the ones who hold these long-term bonds, and I increase the price of a long-term bond, they're going to gain something. So that's pretty straightforward. Whoever holds the long-term bonds is going to gain from a long-term bond price increase. The second one is more subtle and actually in some sense more powerful, because the second part is going to come from the indirect aggregate wealth effect. So what's happening here is this. When I cut my interest rate and my long-term bond increases in value, that's going to push, as we discussed before, the nominal value of nominal assets up. The BT is going to go up. But because prices are sticky, it's going to push up the real value of nominal wealth. Now, for a fixed Varthita, for a fixed distribution of wealth between nominal and real assets, if I increase the value of the nominal assets, I'm going to pool the value of the real assets with me. So that's going to feed into the increase in the capital price for a fixed Varthita. If I can fix my Varthita with some other policy, and I do this interest rate cut, I'm going to act on the capital price as well. I'm going to pool the real wealth up as well. And who is going to benefit from that? Again, these are going to be the intermediaries, because the intermediaries are the ones that are levered in real assets. So in this setup, by increasing the value of capital, I can redistribute wealth towards intermediaries, even if they're not holding any long-term bonds, by cutting the interest rate and increasing the price of the bond. Yes?
I would imagine that intermediaries often don't care as much about the market value of their securities portfolio, and they care about book, in which case you'd almost wonder whether there's a comparative advantage about loading vol in the securities portfolio into the banks, if there's an asymmetry between how much households care about marking the debt versus banks. So that piece is a little bit, I think, unclear to me.
I'd have to think about it. So I'd have to think about it. I don't have an answer to that. So everything that is star is the optimal thing. It's what comes from the planner. Sorry, should have mentioned it. All right, let me do maybe the last thing in the last 2 minutes. So in theory, that's what we can do. We can redistribute towards intermediaries by cutting the interest rates as well. The problem is that this alpha, the distribution of these long-term bonds, is endogenous, which means that if I, let's say, want to achieve a particular sigma eta, so I increase my sigma PL, I make bonds more volatile. Because, as I think Federico was asking, these long-term bonds are an anti-hedge for the intermediaries, they're not going to like it. So as soon as they see my interest rate policy getting more aggressive, they're going to run away, they're going to decrease their alpha, and it could be that they kind of run away from me faster than I'm trying to chase them. And then the question is whether, yeah.
Sorry, for an intermediary, an increase in sigma is a bad state of the bond.
Well, it depends on the policy, depends what the policy is doing. In the last affair, it was.
But here, the intermediary is happy when sigma.
Well, it's the intermediary, I don't know if, probably not happy. So if you're talking about welfare, I guess not. If you're talking about consumption share, yes. So under the optimal policy, the intermediary is going to get a higher consumption share, but that's not necessarily going to get more welfare because they're also going to have more risk.
But just one last question. So in this model, both intermediary and households are marginal investors in the long term.
Yes.
Okay. So the long-term bonds need to be a hedge, an anti-hedge, both for the intermediary and...
No, they are an anti-hedge for the... so that's why we have the convenience yield on the deposits.
Ooh, okay.
Well, not the convenience, the transaction thing that drives the wedge. Because if that was not the case, then they would, the sigma eta would be 0.
I see. So basically, just to understand that, without that convenience yield, the households would have a downward sloping yield curve.
Households will have a downward sloping
Yield curve, in the sense that they would see the long bonds as a hedge, as opposed to the short.
Not really, because if we get, let's talk about it later.
Okay.
But let me conclude. Basically, you have this issue that you want to make bonds more volatile, but then intermediaries run away from that. You can have this kind of graph in which on the x-axis you have the volatility of long-term bond price, on the y-axis how many of these long-term bonds are held by the intermediaries. And the blue line is going to be the distributional efficiency. So these are the combinations of these two variables that deliver the right redistribution following a shock. So if you have very volatile long-term bond price, you don't need that many bonds to be held by the intermediaries. You're going to redistribute through the second kind of general equilibrium effect, not through the direct one. And the red line is basically the alpha is the portfolio choice of intermediaries, how much they choose to hold depending on how volatile these things are. So again, if long-term bonds are very volatile, they're going to hold very few. And it could be that in this picture you have two solutions. So you could have very volatile bonds with very little holdings and things are going to be efficient. Or you can have very sort of moderate interest rate policy, not volatile long-term bonds, but then intermediaries are going to hold a lot of them, and that's still going to be enough to redistribute in the right way. But it could also be that your red line is somewhere here, and then there is no solution. So that means that that's not necessarily going to work for any VRTTL. So your passive balance sheet management needs to be in the right region. And even more, if you want to add the aggregate efficiency back into the picture, you're going to get a vertical line here, because for there's going to be, for a fixed VRTTL, there's going to be one value of sigma PL that's going to deliver you the right total nominal wealth volatility. And then you need all three lines to intersect at one point. And you could maybe achieve that, for example, in the stochastic steady state. You think of stochastic steady state, you make them intersect all at one point. But as soon as you start moving away, these lines start moving, and then you're not in the intersection anymore. Then you have to adjust your VRTTL. You have to conduct active balance sheet management. And I think that's when I should conclude. I have a conclusion slide. I have a few. Punchline.
This extraordinary government, can you implement the extraordinary?
Yes, that's what I just said, right? You can intersect it, but then you just need to I don't know.
You made it sound like it's very hard to make all three intersect.
It's very hard, but you can do it. So that, like, under certain conditions, does not always exist the optimum policy mix, but under relatively mild conditions, you can implement everything, even with the realistic government. You can do the same thing as the unrealistic one does. Thanks, Marcus. Okay, thank you.